Hi, my name is Danny Siegel, and today we're going to be looking at the March PF topic. Now, before we actually go into the topic, I want to encourage everyone to check out the Champion Briefs Institute online, check out our camp over the summer, and definitely look into possibly getting the briefs with some really interesting topic analyses in March and in every single month, as well as just some high-quality evidence that we have on there. So, let's talk about March in general. Now, March isn't a very eventful month when we're talking about different tournaments that are available. There are many different district tournaments which matter a lot for a lot of teams across the country that allow for them to qualify to CFLs or even Nats, so March can be really critical in that way. There are also many novice championships or state or countrywide championships that are important to teams in local regions, as well as just many local tournaments that are available to teams. So let's go in and talk what the topic is. The topic for March is resolved on balance. The current authorization for the use of military force gives too much power to the president. So we're going to be talking about a little bit about the history of the AUMF, what it's usually called abbreviated, what the AUMF actually is, and possible strategies for the affirmative and negative sides. So the AUMF was implemented post 9/11, actually only 3 days after 9/11, September 14th, 2001. And what the AUMF allowed for presidents to essentially do is use, and this is in quotes, all necessary and appropriate force against those he or she determined planned, authorized, committed, or aided the September 11th attacks, or who harbored said citizens or groups. So what it essentially allows for presidents to do is have a blank check to invade, call upon airstrikes, call upon drones, or do whatever they want in regions across the world if it relates to 9/11. The thing is the way the bill or the way the executive order is passed, or the way the bill was essentially passed is like very vague. So presidents have used it in the past in places like Afghanistan, the Philippines, Georgia, Yemen, and most recently last year Trump used it to bomb the Syrian jet field. So it's essentially used as a blank check, which is why the resolution questions whether presidents are given too much power in a world in which you have the AUMF available. So if a president can necessarily go into any country, bomb, or call upon or send ground troops to any country as he or she wishes, is that too much power? Why is this a topic now? Now, just like public forum debate is usually conducted, the topics are generally ripped from the headlines, and on June 29, 2017, a group of individuals in the House Appropriations Committee approved an amendment to end the 2001 authorization within 40 days, which would have forced debate on the replacement authorization, but the amendment was eventually removed by the Rules Committee, so the AUMF remains in effect today. So the question of the resolution is whether it should actually still exist or whether it provides too much power to the president. Let's talk about the framing of the topic. So what does it mean to have too much power to the president? What type of impact is this? Now, I think it's important to note that this isn't really an impact. It's more like an internal link, right? Having too much power doesn't really give you any type of offense in the round. Rather, proving the resolution true doesn't mean people die, or it doesn't mean that you have money lost, or anything that's actually impactful. It's more of a philosophical question. So we haven't really seen anything like that this year, at least on the topics that we've been provided, but we have seen just historically in PF topics that are centered around philosophical concepts, which I would say is similar to this one. The thing is in public forum debate, since you have such a large diversity of judges, you have lay, flay, and flow judges, generally speaking, you can't necessarily collapse and only make philosophical arguments, as even though that's what I think the individuals who wrote the resolution wanted you to do, it doesn't necessarily end up you don't actually end up being able to win rounds just making philosophical arguments, since there really is no pragmatic side to the debate. Like, how do you convince an individual that, like, a president having too much power is really more detrimental than, like, individuals dying abroad due to a genocide? So a lot of the times, at least you'll see on topics like this, teams just bite the bullet and make pragmatic arguments, but today we're going to talk about a possible strategy where you can continue to make philosophical debate or make philosophical arguments with a little bit of a pragmatic twist, so that way you don't necessarily alienate judges that might not necessarily understand philosophical arguments, or be able to beat teams who are reading pragmatic arguments, even though that's not necessarily what they should be doing on the topic, but simply saying like, oh, that's not what you should be doing on the topic isn't necessarily persuasive. So this strategy should help. All right. Why do you want to make pragmatic arguments? Or why do you want to make these pragmatic philosophical arguments? And the answer to that question is more adaptation, right? Being able to adapt to panels is probably the most difficult thing to do in rounds, at least in public forum, because you have such diverse judges. Being able to make arguments that are persuasive to people who are parents or to individuals who actually understand how the flow works is very difficult. And in order for you to do that, you should be making arguments that both fit what the writers of the resolution wanted you to do, but at the same time don't sacrifice arguments that are not necessarily meant to be run on the topic. So let's talk about possible pro-arguments. So with the resolution being whether the AUMF necessarily gives too much power to the president, I think an interesting pro-argument could be focused more on the social contract aspect. Now, just saying social contract, right, and that the framework should be on the social contract isn't an argument you can make. You have to provide an actual warrant to why we should be looking at the social contract. So let's talk about the most generic, right? I think a lot of teams in rounds don't necessarily give warrants to their arguments or framework that explains why we should be viewing the round in that certain manner. So this round should be viewed in a social contract, which means that we should be looking at what the United States citizens want first. And this is because they pay money to the government to provide them their rights through taxes. And that means that the government should listen to them first before people abroad or countries abroad. That is a well-warranted framework for what a social contract argument is, or what a social contract framework is. So why I think this should be an affirmative argument is because I think you can make the argument that like sending troops abroad or sending airstrikes abroad or sending drones abroad put American lives at risk. And this is problematic. As a president, he or she can go to war whenever they want, and then go into individual warrants why presidents might be more likely to go to war than Congress, right? One, the decision-making calculus, right? You have 300 people making a decision versus like one individual saying like yes or no. Obviously, probability-wise, it's a 50-50 chance you actually go to war in a world in which you have one person versus like in a world in which you have 300 people, which means that generally speaking, one person doesn't necessarily have to listen to any type of debate that takes place. They can just say yes or no. While 300 people, it takes a lot longer of a period of time, as well as it takes discussion and requires the forming of coalitions. So a president might be more likely to go to war. Second reason why presidents might be more likely to go to war is because the idea of term limits, right? Because Congress doesn't necessarily have term limits, the president doesn't necessarily feel the consequences of war when it comes to like his or her approval rating. Like some might argue that Bush never really felt the consequences of entering into the Iraq War until his second term or until after his second term, right? So essentially you could make the argument that if a president were to go to war and they were in their second term, they can essentially do whatever they want their second term because it doesn't necessarily affect their reputation. It doesn't affect whether they'll get reelected since they're not running again. So they might be more likely than someone in Congress to engage in war simply because they're not going to be affected in the future other than their just reputation nationally, which a lot, I think you could argue, they care significantly less about their reputation nationally after they leave office than like the Congress members who want to keep their job. So I know, okay, so what is the impact to this argument, right? The impact to the argument is troops dying and people losing their lives, and under the social contract, that's more important than like saving lives abroad. So I know this argument isn't necessarily philosophical, and some might argue doesn't necessarily fit the resolution, right? Let's go ahead and read the resolution once again. On balance, the current authorization of military force gives too much power to the president. I think you can make this argument philosophical. If someone says like, oh, how does this fit the resolution? You could make the argument that like, a president has too much power if he or she controls the lives of thousands of troops through a yes or no question, right? Whether they decide to sign the bill or not, they control the lives of thousands of troops, and at the point where they do that, you could argue that that is too much power, right? I think turning pragmatic arguments into philosophical arguments rather than doing the other way around is a lot more effective in public forum debate, just for you being able to adapt to large panels and diverse panels, as well as just making stronger arguments that are more impactful and have a lot more weight. And an example of this is teams are going to read the idea of what it is like to be constitutional or not in terms of the resolution, right? Not being able to engage in war, at least the Constitution states Congress should have the decision of whether a president should engage in war or not. And while I think that argument is relatively persuasive and you can just say like, oh, Congress ought to decide that, there's no impact to that argument when teams on the opposite side are going to say that like, we ought go to war or the president ought have this responsibility if it means stopping genocide or self-defense or anything in that manner. So while they're impacting to lives and you're impacting to the Constitution, while I think the Constitution is absolutely important, parents in the back of the room might think, well, killing people versus like constitutional rights, I think constitutional rights can be sacrificed a lot easier than the idea of people dying. Just because the default almost always in public forum debate is utilitarianism, and generally people don't view deontology as the most effective way to evaluate policy. So that's why I think you should be focusing on more pragmatic arguments and think how you can actually make them resolutional through looking at them through a philosophical lens. So let's talk about a pragmatic argument possibly on the con that teams could read. So I think an interesting argument that you can read on the con is this whole idea of what the United States responsibility is in the global community, right? Like, what is United States hegemony? Like, what are the goals of the U.S.? And a lot of people argue that as the most powerful nation on earth, we ought be the policeman, and we ought go to war or attack individuals who are ultimately causing chaos in the international community, right? So because we are an international leader, we should go ahead and stop genocides, stop dictatorships, attack organizations like ISIS, be able to take out leaders, send airstrikes to destroy military bases that pose a threat to national security for us and pose a threat to international security. So in a world in which we don't have AUMF, not only does this significantly take longer, but it also means that we're probably less likely to go to war for the same warrants as I provided above as reasons why presidents are more likely to go to war. So those warrants can also function on terms of negative arguments, because going to war isn't necessarily bad if it means going to war for a relatively good reason, and that means saving innocent lives abroad. But the thing is, under this con argument, you wouldn't be necessarily viewing the resolution through a social contract framework, but rather one that values all lives equally, right? So like individuals in Afghanistan that are being attacked by terrorist organizations matter just as much as individuals who are falling into poverty here in the United States, or the troops that are coming over to Afghanistan to help defeat the organizations. And it's really a question of body count rather than it is a question of whose lives are being lost. And a well-warranted argument as to why all lives should be mattered rather than just like U.S. lives is just the same argument we made above, that like no other country has the same amount of resources as the United States. So we should protect the international community through providing troops abroad, through providing airstrikes abroad, and through using drones abroad. Or another argument you can make is that like helping save innocent people in other countries is still in the framework of the social contract if somebody's reading a social contract framework against you, because being able to develop areas or stop instability allows for stable trading partners in the near future, which is extremely important as it means lowering the price of goods here at home, or just simply ensuring that the threats abroad don't spread and cause a problem for us, or just the threats abroad spreading means that we're going to be pulled into during a much worse period of time, which has a lot more chaos, which is more problematic as it means more U.S. lives will eventually be lost. So weighing under that social contract framework is definitely still possible, but providing unique responses to it and then conceding it and seeing how you can win under their framework allows for more responses for them to deal with in summary, as well as more responses for you to go for in your summary and final focus. So strategically speaking, that I think is an interesting argument to read against the social contract framework, especially if you're reading this argument. Now, we got off a little off topic, so back to the argument we were talking to on the con. The United States' role is to promote stability abroad. We do this through the AUMF, whether it's providing airstrikes, whether it's attacking organizations abroad or destroying dictatorships. Without the AUMF, we'd be less likely to be a global player because we'd have like more red tape, or we'd have to require congressional approval, which either takes longer or doesn't happen as often. And the impact of this argument is saving lives abroad, right? And I think the interesting argument you make on this is the president doesn't have too much power if it means that they have the ability to protect individuals across the world, if that makes any sense. So rather than viewing this as them being able to decide whether troops live or die, right, the president is deciding whether the president is essentially deciding whether sending troops, airstrikes, or any other various militaristic operations abroad saves the lives of innocent people in other countries. All right, let's go into something really interesting that I think is especially prevalent on this topic that can easily happen that you have to be very careful of. So there's this idea of nuking the flow, right? What does that mean? So there are arguments that can be made on this topic that take out offense on both sides, and this is extremely problematic, right? What is this argument? So the AUMF was implemented, like we explained earlier, post-2001, in September 14th specifically, but obviously war's been around a lot longer. So people can say things that non-unique this resolution entirely and take out offense on both sides, which is extremely problematic for both sides. Someone can easily say something like, on the negative, Eisenhower went into the Korean War without congressional approval, or James Madison seized territory in West Florida without congressional approval, or even Andrew Jackson invading Florida 3 different times without permission from Congress. Why is this problematic? As it means that whether the AUMF exists or not, the president still has the power to do something. And that completely changes the resolution, as it means that any of the offense that comes up on the affirmative is essentially like mute, but also like all arguments on the negative is essentially mute too, which just makes the round extremely confusing and muddled if you have a technical judge in the back of the room. So I think ways you can respond to this argument, and you have to be careful not to say this in rounds because you just make it harder on yourself because there's no offense, but also be prepared to respond to this argument in case the team accidentally reads it and just wants to self-destruct, save the entire round. Chances are teams that are reading arguments like this, you're probably going to be beating them anyway, just because this argument, if you actually understand how it functions, hurts everyone in the round and doesn't really provide any benefit to either team. So responses to the idea that like AUMF existing or AUMF not existing wouldn't make a difference of what wars presidents would actually go into. The first thing you need to say to this is that like during this period of time there wasn't a lot of media or social media available, so presidents could essentially do whatever they wanted. And in a world in which a president were to do something like this when the AUMF doesn't exist, they'd receive a significant amount of backlash. And this is important as not only can they get constituent backlash and it hurt their approval rating, but also constituents want their congressional leaders to do what they want. And if a president were to engage in war, I think there would be sufficient amount of protests, if it didn't necessarily require congressional approval and it was unconstitutional, for these congressional leaders to cause or create some sort of rumors of impeachment, which would be very problematic for the president as they want to remain in office and they want to remain and have a good reputation outside the office. So modern times essentially solves back because you can have individuals who are educated about what the president is doing is not okay. Or, yeah, you can have because individuals are more educated about what the president is doing and be able to recognize whether it's okay versus during the Korean War or during any of the wars that were under Madison or Andrew Jackson. Another response to this argument is the existence of the AUMF changes the game. This is because a world without the AUMF would require repeal and signal to the president the actions of non-congressionally approved wars shouldn't be allowed. So essentially, because the AUMF exists, it means that you are signaling to the president that the actions of because the existence of the AUMF, and if the AUMF was removed, it would eliminate the vagueness of the Constitution in order to determine whether presidents can actually engage in war or not. So it would send a message that it is typically not allowed, and it's unlikely a president would actually engage in war under the removal of the AUMF than they would in a world with the AUMF, if that makes any sense. Okay, so that's the end of our video. Before I go, I just want to once again give a shout out to the Champion Briefs Institute. Definitely go check out our briefs, check out the camp this summer, and I highly encourage you to watch more topic analysis in the future. I hope this one helped, and I look forward to seeing you next time.